How are we doing on levels? Okay. Now's the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. It's nice to see you all again. Thanks for coming out on Juneteenth Eve. One of the things I learned, I'm not from around here. You guys may know this by now. I discovered moving to the region that at 69 degrees in the evening or 71 in the morning, all the weather maps turned red. I was like, oh, that's interesting. What do you do if it gets warmer than this? And now it is. And so we're watching the weather map kind of change. So where I come from, 71 is not a weather advisory, but obviously it's getting very hot. It was 93 degrees when I left Cambridge at 4:30 this afternoon. So I'm very thankful to be here. Dick, thank you for your hospitality. Thanks to the church and everyone here, and the team for organizing this. And good morning, the new projector. Thanks for this. It's a pleasure to be back. I know some of you have heard the front end of this before, so I'll be brief, but we also have some friends joining us online in the future, and so for their purposes, I'll share a little bit of the backstory. In that context, I also want to introduce my colleague, Jason Beckfield from Sociology at Harvard, who's joining us, and will be working on us over the coming years. Jason, thanks for being here and joining us. And I'll hand off in a few minutes to my colleague, Sarah Page. I got a phone call unprompted in January of 2020, back when I still answered the phone. And Valerie Nelson asked me, well, why the heck weren't my research group doing more on the North Shore? And I had no answer. I didn't know exactly what I wasn't doing up here. But having said that, over the last many years, we've had a great collaboration with the Cape Ann Climate Coalition, and this work has been productive in a variety of ways. I'll say a little bit about our group and where we come from. So we're from the design school at Harvard, so we're architects and landscape architects and urban planners. We're concerned about the future of the built environment broadly. We include engineers and ecologists. And my research group is called the Office for Urbanization. And so what we do is we work with faculty, we engage with community, and we try to help illuminate challenges around the built environment with some kind of forward perspective. Often we're doing this with respect to climate adaptation. So one of the portfolios of work that we develop is helping folks think about how the climate is changing already and to begin to visualize that change over the coming decades. And we've done this work across the country, the world, and it struck us as a great opportunity to have a close at hand collaboration with respect to climate adaptation. In our work, we will often, and in this case, we'll show you some work that comes through a methodology called scenario planning. Right? So scenario planning is a way of thinking about the future in which we're not trying to predict with any sense of like, that will be the predicted outcome, but rather we're, from a present situation, thinking about the future in ways through various scenarios. If this, for example, if the 9/11 system just goes down statewide for 2 hours this afternoon, what would happen next? I can tell you this afternoon, I got a text from my employer saying, just call your local authorities, and I have no idea who they are. I could, it's like a mile to the city hall in Cambridge, I could get over there, but, so in that kind of a situation, our work in scenario planning is a method that's been endorsed by the IPCC and other folks thinking about climate in a deep and serious way. And the goal, again, is not to wish any ill will on anyone, nor to say, well, this is statistically going to be the outcome, but rather to use future scenarios to try to place a kind of pressure test, a stress test, if you will, on the physical, the built and lived environments. In that sense, we began in 2020 with doing a kind of deep cultural dive. As I say, not being from around here, I try to approach our work in that way, trying to understand the culture in a way from the layers of history that we built here. And I've come to really love this place. It's like literally built of granite. Both the people and the place are incredibly resilient, having been here for both millennia and thousands of years, but also more recently 400 years of a certain kind of settlement. So in that context, Cape Ann is really valuable for us as a form of collaboration. We've been greatly supported by our friends in the coalition because our job really is to help bring the best available knowledge to challenges in the world and also make available to our students and our faculty and our research staff the most interesting contexts in the world. And for us, this has been a really fascinating project. The first phase of that, what we call phase one, is now publicly available. In it, we model the future near-term synthetic storm, a kind of middling hurricane of 2038. Again, it's kind of instrument, a thought experiment, if you will, to try to understand, well, what are the vulnerabilities? Now, folks around here have been quite used to, surviving and thriving in the context of nor'easters, nuisance flooding of various kinds, and in fact, we're coming out of a period in which hurricane activity, tropical storm activity has been quite limited in the recent past. Having said that, it seems quite evident in the research that we study that we can expect increasing sea level rise. We can see increased storm event and increased intensity of storms, and that combined with fragility in the housing insurance market around extreme weather events, the cascading effects of heat impacts and other extreme weather, all of those things are interesting as we think about this work. So that study of this synthetic storm event identified a variety of infrastructures built in natural environments that are a part of the lived experience of Cape Ann, a part of the physical infrastructure, a part of the cultural landscapes, a part of the biome, a part of the non-human aspects of what makes living here so wonderful. We followed that up with what we call the scenario one, which was near future adaptations, in which we looked at a variety of topics, things that you might want to be thinking about. Now again, this is not at the level of a diagnosis nor even a prescription. It's simply stepping back and saying, well, in other contexts, people facing these kinds of challenges have thought about these kinds of topics. So what we're doing is we're gathering literature, precedent projects, we're trying to identify the best available practices, primarily from the US, occasionally from North America, occasionally from Western Europe. And as we do that, we're building a kind of body of knowledge that's coming from a wide variety of disciplines, right? So our work is connected, it's building from the work of a variety of other people, all of whom are footnoted extensively in that 800-page, 800-pound report that Dick referenced. I won't belabor the details of scenario one. It's available in a public-facing website, and it has been through a series of public conversations like these. And for any of you that want to have access to it, just let us know, and we'll be sure to get you to that URL. We'll mention it again later in the presentation. For this past year, in 2023, we were very excited to focus on the natural landscapes or the cultural landscapes of Cape Ann. So under the topic of regenerative landscapes, thinking about conservation practices that have been really quite central in the region and quite central here in Cape Ann. It's one of the primary tools, ways of thinking about the natural environment. And then building a body of knowledge, gathering all of the studies that have been done, and the place that's been studied extensively, we're happy to find. And moving increasingly from conservation to a focus on climate adaptation. This work, and the subject of what we'll be sharing with you, a portion of that this evening, includes a variety of sub-studies, let's say, in which we look at the existing conditions of the various biomes, the various landscape resources, the various threats and challenges, and in which we can say very clearly that changing climate is already putting pressure on these ecosystems, like flora and fauna, among other things. To that, there's added desire and need for housing, right? We know that there are 1,000 households at least in the FEMA floodplain on Cape Ann. That's not a good thing. Having said that, there's no immediate solution for that on Wednesday. In that context, we can say some simple things like, it's probably good to stop building houses in the floodplain, as well as car dealerships and grocery stores, among other things. Having said that, any future storm event or extreme weather event will put pressure on housing, and it will increase the vulnerability of those that are socioeconomically disadvantaged with respect to their ability to be resilient, to build in place, to rebuild after a storm event, etc. So one of the things we did in the study was we modeled where could people go market rate as of right if they were in the floodplain and had to leave, and it's not around Cape Ann. That brings us to questions of density and increasing housing, of course, which is quite eagerly resisted by most people around here, as far as I can tell, based on my conversation. So there's a nexus between climate events, weather events, vulnerability of people really exposed by virtue of their zip code and their economic precarity to a kind of set of structural environmental injustices. And at the same moment, future events will put greater pressure on that going forward. We've also looked at a variety of case studies. We've looked at a variety of initiatives that might be undertaken, some of which are already ongoing, as well as a series of potential regional planning strategies, as well as a series of interventions, right? And again, so we're not here to advocate for any one of these. Our role is to do the research, identify the practices that are available that might be relevant, and then make them available to people. In that regard, of course, we're happy to give our opinions professionally about things. But I will say, ultimately, the future of Cape Ann is in the hands of people in the room like yourselves. Cape Anners will decide. And to that, the other thing to keep in mind is that individuals
and institutions are already making choices, right? So in that context, it's not as though there's one singular project or there's one idea. This set of initiatives comes out of a great deal of groundwork that was laid for years and years before we got involved, and it's dependent upon the goodwill of everyone here as well as many, many other colleagues who contributed to it. Having said that, we don't want you to think of this as one thing or one project, but rather it's really a kind of field of action in which individual landowners, individual institutions, political organizations, various agencies are already acting and making choices. And as they do so, I think we share an interest in being both informed about that thought process and decision-making process, but equally trying to make available the research that we have at our disposal in the work of so many great academics and professionals working here and elsewhere across the country. We focused in this regenerative landscape study on really 4 biomes. This is a little bit a kind of fiction. It's a kind of distillation of the world because the world is more complex and interesting than that. But in those 4 biomes, the so-called downtown, forest, marsh, and beach, we try to distill bodies of scientific knowledge because it's very rare that you find field scientists or ecologists that can cut across all of them. And in doing that, we've thought deeply, long and hard with the advice of many great academic advisors and many local experts here about each of these 4. In previous conversations we've shared with you are thinking about downtowns, environmental justice neighborhoods, forests, and the forest biome. And tonight we're going to focus on the wet work, beaches, marsh, the stuff that draws us to Cape Ann, among many other things. So in that context, I'll invite my colleague Sarah Page to take us forward.
Thank you so much, Charles, for that introduction and the framing of the work. I think that's really helpful for us all to kind of get oriented to what we're going to talk about tonight. So as Charles said, when we talk about the 4 landscapes, that is an imaginary thing that distills them down into things that we can comprehend and process. But this begins to talk about what that means on a more complex level. So when we have our 4 main landscapes, downtown, forest, marsh, and beach, those are referring to the scientific habitats that exist and then also the species that live within those habitats. And one thing that this diagram acknowledges is that while there are lots of species, humans are a species that lives within all of these habitats, and then also the infrastructure that facilitates human occupation of Cape Ann is in all of those landscapes as well. So that's something that's important for us to realize. And now, even though we're categorizing them as 4 separate things, they are all interconnected in various ways, and that will become evident as we kind of talk through these more specific things. So this is the distribution of the landscape types across Cape Ann. The darker color that hopefully we can see is the coastal condition all the way into our forested areas. And so this research has looked at them in various ways. So the first thing that it did was look at all of the value of these various ecosystems, and then identify the challenges that they're currently facing, and then to provide scenario plans and potential initiatives that address these challenges. So that's kind of what the research was trying to do at the broadest scale. And so then in organizing these scenarios and initiatives, they have been put into these different categories of projects, site plans, regional plans, studies. And as Charles said, this is meant to be a menu of potential actions that can be taken on by different stakeholders. And we identified over 150 of them and then have organized them in various ways in the 800-page, 800-pound report that we're talking about today, and that you see like a menu synopsis, like wayfinding guide of on your tables that we'll kind of talk through. So also, as Charles mentioned, this is the 3rd of a 3-part series. The first meeting, we were able to do kind of an overview of all of these landscapes. And then in the second meeting, we really focused on forests and downtowns. And then tonight, we're really focusing on beaches and marshes. So we're going to start with our beach landscapes, which Cape Ann's beach landscapes, we're including in that both ocean, maritime beach, and then also rocky intertidal areas. And they're really distributed around the entire coast of Cape Ann. And so some of the cultural significance of these landscapes is that they inspire cultural identity, artistic expression, and then the coast is also beloved by dog walkers, sunbathers, surfers, filmmakers, other residents. I'm sure that everyone is very familiar with that as we enjoy these spaces ourselves. And then the other thing that's important about this coastal condition is industry support. So Gloucester, Cape Ann is really well known for the working waterfront. And then also, so that's how it's operating with an industry, but then also these ecosystems and habitats are vital to support that industry also along the coast. And then finally, it is this critical habitat. So there are over 300 known species of birds, animals, reptiles, and amphibians that live in the Gulf of Maine, as well as over 3,000 species of vascular plants. So it's very important in that respect as well. So while this research really took a broad sweep of understanding the coastal conditions on Cape Ann, we did identify a specific case study to help us understand it in more depth and detail. And so that case study is Good Harbor Beach. So in the larger report, we really break down the different habitats that exist within Good Harbor, and then we identify some of the good and bad things that are happening there towards that ecosystem, and then we have tracked how it's changed over time, and then provide a series of recommendations to mitigate those challenges. And this work was really based on a long series of reports. It is on the website and in the published document. This is just a maybe diagrammatic representation of all those reports. A lot of the people in this room helped either sponsor or compile these reports, and they were very critical to doing this work. And so if anybody is less familiar with Good Harbor Beach as a whole, we'll kind of quickly do an introduction. Good Harbor really is this multifaceted ecosystem. It has several interconnected habitats, a few of which are the beach, dunes, and rocky intertidal zone that then has the high marsh, low marsh, and estuary habitats behind that are interconnected through the tidal creek. And then they are intersected by these different impervious surfaces and buildings throughout. So Good Harbor's habitats are in transition currently due to both human intervention and climate change. A few of the major challenges that are faced by the beach is the loss of beach landscapes as a whole, vulnerable species, and then also the continued pollution. So we have took this analysis and then all of the many potential ways to intervene and organize them based on these set of scenarios. So scenario 0 looks at business as usual, no intervention. So what will happen in Good Harbor Beach if things continue on and nothing is done? Scenario 1 is business as usual, everyone keeps operating as we're currently operating, but using conventional interventions within this space. Scenario 2 looks at collaboration between existing stakeholders, but then proposes a few more progressive interventions. And then scenario 3 looks at systemic change. That's about changing agency or the creation of new groups or collaborations and some more innovative interventions. So here we can take those scenarios and then put them in relationship to different types of infrastructure. And that's how we've begun to organize all of these different interventions. So we have a representation of the plugs that go in these holes, and that's what's represented on your table. That is the menu of options. So there's a lot of work behind each one of these boxes that are where the two things intersect. And we don't have time to go into all of them in depth tonight, but we've picked two different infrastructure categories to talk about as a whole on the screen. So the first one we'll start with is beach restoration as ecological infrastructure. So the major challenge that we're addressing with this infrastructure type is beach erosion due to sea level rise. And so there are a lot of resources that are available to kind of let us know about the type of beach erosion that's happening, where it's happening, and the rate that it's happened historically. And so we have documentation of that challenge, which is important. So scenario 0, looking if nothing happens, what will occur? So beaches will continue to erode due to sea level rise, and they will not be able to migrate inland. That's part of the challenge. And beach and dune habitats could be lost completely, and then this will result in a loss of species diversity. So scenario 1, looking at, okay, everyone is operating as usual, but thinking about a few interventions that could happen, is looking at beach restoration, so maintaining this space. So the beach could be nourished every 2 years in the late spring. And so for future reference, as we move forward, there will be information about the specific context that we're talking about on the left, and then case studies on the right of projects that are similar to what we're recommending, but we won't go into depth about each of those. But in addition to nourishing the beach, there is potential to seed key species such as eelgrass and mussels along some of these areas. Scenario 2 is looking at collaboration between stakeholders and a little bit more progressive intervention. So one of those options is seeding different vegetation along the dunes to stabilize them, and this occurs because of the deepening of the root structure of those plants. But the risk that comes with that is that these things could be washed away because they're a bit reactive. They're like, okay, trying to stabilize what's currently there, but not protecting what's there. So this article is a little blurry, but it's talking about the project where that was washed away really quickly. So money was spent and then it was degraded really fast. So we addressed that in scenario 3 by looking at a project that is a bit more proactive. And so that is talking about restoration. So we're developing living breakwaters. And so the way that living breakwaters work is you're basically constructing a larger system that diffuses wave energy. And then it also serves as a habitat for species. So the people who did the project that we're referring to here is landscape architects, and they were able to join us for the Cape Ann Conversation series, which is available online. So if you'd like to hear a little bit more about their project and like the pros and cons, because there are definitely things that you're gaining and then things that you're giving up by taking on a project like that, you can hear them speak more about it on the website, which is great. And another thing to notice, acknowledge, is that any interventions that happen on Good Harbor Beach will affect the other beaches on Cape Ann, because they are all interconnected systems. So scenario 3 also recommends a regional coalition to come together to discuss all of the beaches as a group that we can see here. So we have that row of possible interventions within that one infrastructure type. And so these happen to be an and situation. So there's the option to maintain and seed and restore, but that's not the case for all of the different infrastructure types, and we'll see that in the next example. So this is about, the beach restoration is about addressing the problems that we see on the beach. It's very seeing them where we see them. Addressing them where we see them. But there are also lots of problems that are caused beyond the beach immediately. And so those infrastructures are kind of the other ones. And so we're going to focus on one of those examples tonight, but on your sheet you can see that there are several more. So the one that we'll talk about is wastewater infrastructure and how they pertain to household systems specifically. So one thing that people might be aware of is that Good Harbor Beach and Creek have currently been experiencing a rise in bacteria levels over time. And this has resulted in mandated beach closures, lack of access for the community, and also degraded habitat that harms species. And I know a lot of you have probably been following this information as it's been released. If you haven't, this is a quick synopsis of what has been going on. Basically, bacteria levels on beaches throughout Massachusetts has been rising pretty steadily over the last about a decade. And in 2021, there was a large spike in bacteria at the Good Harbor Creek, and the city responded by closing the creek several times. And then in 2022, the creek was closed for the entire summer season. And then a consultant group was hired in to do an evaluation of the infrastructure surrounding Good Harbor Beach. And then in 2023 and 24, they've expanded testing to see the bacteria levels and how they're changing, and then are closing them more frequently just to an abundance of caution. So here we can kind of see how this all works out spatially. So if we see Good Harbor Beach down here at the bottom, and then this larger black line, that is the Good Harbor Beach watershed. It's over 500 acres, it's very large. So every bit of water that goes into this land area eventually makes it to Good Harbor Beach, unless it's piped through the wastewater system or the rain one-off system. And so the surface water samples that had a bacteria exceedance were collected around the creek area in Good Harbor Beach. And then this dashed line that we can see a little bit is the consultant's study area. So that's where they were really looking at the pipes and understanding and diagnosing their condition. So the report came back with some conclusions. And the first conclusion was that there's no one big problem and one big solution. So there's not one pipe that is in one place that needs to be replaced. It's a much more diffused problem, which is both good and bad. So one thing that they talk about is there's risk during flooding. So they identified several locations where sewage is susceptible to leaking out of pipes when the flows reach an elevated or surcharged capacity. And so this is a problem because Thatcher Road, which is represented here, has started flooding on a pretty regular basis. It floods during nor'easters, during small thunderstorms, like on Friday. I personally got caught in that one, so that was a little treacherous driving over Thatcher Road. But then they also looked at surface water samples that had a significant indication of human-related bacteria. And that was both near all of the major outpoints of this sewage system. And so that basically tells us that these systems were not designed to be flooded. And so both the groundwater table is rising and they're being inundated frequently over the top. So the study wasn't able to really dive deep into what that means for these systems because they were just seeing how they operate on a day-to-day basis, not when they're being completely flooded. So that's not an answer to anything, but it adds another kind of question mark. So because of that, we know that the wastewater system isn't operating optimally. We don't know exactly what the problem is, but we know that there is a problem. So more studies need to be done to understand the problem more fully, but our research just looked at wastewater systems as a whole and what can be done. So scenario 0 about pollution on Good Harbor Beach looks at a couple things. One is that pump stations will be flooded during storm events. There are several pump stations around Good Harbor Beach that are in the flood zone, which compromises the system as a whole. And then also that the pipes will continue to be a problem and that private systems could continue to be a problem. Scenario 1 looks at kind of being reactive to this. So it's elevating the pump stations and then informing residents that there's a risk, just letting everybody know what's going on. Scenario 2 is being a little bit more proactive, so thinking about these wastewater systems in a different way. And so there are lots of gray infrastructure possibilities to kind of come in, and it's no surprise that the wastewater needs some attention. It's been around for a long time. As we talked about, this is a city with a long history, so that makes sense. But there are also a couple of green infrastructure possibilities that look at how we can manage wastewater. So one of those is through constructed wetlands, so it's looking at how that can be treated locally and at different scales. Another is through containers. So there are certain products that you can buy that you filter wastewater through that takes the bacteria to use that filtration and then releases that water in a very strategic place based on how it's being cleaned. There are examples of this actually reducing bacteria. So they're able to clean it to a higher degree than the streams currently are, and then you can release it out, which helps flush out bacteria. But that would need more information before implementation. It's just an example. And then the other is to seed rib mussels throughout the area so they can also work to filter out the bacteria. So those are inedible ribbed mussels, very important. And so scenario 3 is just looking at a slightly different scale. So it's thinking about Cape Anne's wastewater system as a whole instead of just within one site. So whether it's able to be addressed at just one site or at a regional scale is based on what stakeholders are involved and then how much money is available at different points in time. So there's a lot of factors that go into which scenario gets to be pursued. But this map is an indication of the Cape Anne's wastewater system as a whole. So all of Essex's waste and then Gloucester's waste is being processed in this area. So it just kind of indicates what the scale of this issue. And then also because the wastewater system is a problem at a larger scale, that means that the bacteria on Good Harbor Beach is not an isolated issue. All of the beaches across Cape Anne have had past violations of bacteria at different times over different years. So that's something that's also important to notice. I feel like that Good Harbor has gotten a lot of attention, but it is a much larger problem. And so this specific infrastructure type is not an and situation, it's more of an or situation. So it's either elevate or redesign or utilize. And so this is a decision that needs to be made of which is being pursued because the financial implications don't want to be disseminated against projects that counteract one another, but to be focused on ones that can work very strategically. So that's something that's important to kind of note. They're not a phasing where you would first elevate and then redesign and then utilize because they just don't work that way. So those were just 2 of the items that are on your sheet. So as you move into discussion, you can kind of explore some that might be of more interest to you. So within the Office for Urbanization, we have provided this menu of options, as Charles said, and provided case studies and different information about them. And then we selected various scenarios just to visualize. So this is not a prescriptive this scenario is better than another, but it's just an idea of what they mean spatially. So those are the drawings that you have in plan and then the larger aerial representation. So in plan, we've selected a couple things. We drew out the living breakwaters and just imagined where they would need to be based on the technical information that we had available to us. We imagined a little bit about the transportation infrastructure, which we didn't really talk about, but we just drew out a scenario where parking is maintained but reduced, and then there is an elevated walkway that goes over the marsh that allows expanding parking options, and then also people to see and understand the marsh system a bit better. So those are not things that we're saying this is the correct answer. We're just imagining what they would look like in space. And then also so how they would benefit humans, but then also the species that would be able to occupy these spaces. So beach landscapes are vast, and the Good Harbor Beach case study allows us to see them in a new light, which is really great. So now we're going to talk a little bit about marsh landscapes in the same way. So marsh landscapes are also occupied by various habitats and species, including humans. They're distributed throughout Cape Ann. Every municipality in Cape Ann has some evidence of marsh habitat and landscape. They have lots of benefits. One is carbon sequestration. Another is they really help buffer storm surge and mitigate flood risk. And then they also support marine ecosystems. They're really the base of the food chain for the entire marine ecosystem, which is very important. And so in a similar way, we looked at Cape Ann's marshes as a whole, but then zoomed into the West Annisquam River marsh system. And so within the report, we looked at how these habitats are interconnected, the positive and negative things they're currently experiencing, how they've changed over time, and then provided a series of recommendations based on that research. And also similarly, there are so many reports that have gone into this, and they're all available on the website and in the physical report. And so again, the Annisquam River Marsh is also a multifaceted ecosystem, and it has several interconnected habitats. First is the low marsh, which is always inundated, and then the high marsh, which is sometimes inundated by water, and then tidal flats, which are directly related to the estuary system. So similar to beaches, marsh habitats are in transition due to human intervention and climate change. Some of the biggest challenges that they face are the loss of marsh landscapes, the continued pollution, and invasive species. So in a similar fashion, we've taken the 4 scenarios and divided all of our recommendations into that menu, and then have a different list of infrastructures that are related to those scenarios. So, and these we'll also look at too. So one is about ecological infrastructure, specifically habitat and species restoration. So the challenge that is specifically addressing is the loss of marsh habitat. So one problem is that the high marsh is drowning. So as water continues to rise, that means more of the marsh is inundated on a more frequent basis. So all the species that live in the high marsh area can no longer occupy that space. So lots of species are losing their homes. And then also there's pollution that is degrading these habitats. So scenario 0, if the marsh, nothing happens in the marsh and it continues on its current trajectory, we will experience this loss of marsh habitat. And we have good resources. This is the Massachusetts Sea Level Affecting Marshes model, and they have projected what this will look like in different time frames. And it's a helpful resource for us to kind of understand what that will mean. Scenario 1 looks at monitoring. So continuing to monitor the species that are in the marsh, continuing to monitor how mean high tide is changing, just so that we understand what's happening. And then also pursuing some of the existing restoration projects that have been proposed. There are lots of really refined recommendations about specific culverts that could use some attention and things like that. So addressing those is really important. Scenario 2, thinking about some stakeholder collaboration and some more progressive interventions, looks at facilitating. So collaborating to create management plan and organizing interventions, including seeding vegetation. So seeding has been happening in the marsh system for quite a while. There are lots of people who are interested in that. And there have been a few past projects where eelgrass has been seeded and then removed by a different group. And a lot of that is just due to not understanding each other's perspective. So this highlights the importance of collaboration. So everyone kind of knows what's happening within these habitats and then can kind of get on board with different groups' efforts. And then the other thing that there's potential to explore is living shorelines. So this is kind of similar to living breakwaters, but it is at a smaller scale. So these are products that you can buy and then place along the marsh edges. And they both help with wave energy just a bit, like just with the absorption of water, but more importantly, they're habitats for shellfish to occupy. And then scenario 3 looks at stakeholders that not are just like talking to one another, but actually working together to decide the best way to move forward, and then also trying out some new innovative strategies. This is this like floating marsh vegetation system. So these are all things that need studies and they need pilot projects before they're implemented at scale, but it's just thinking about the ways that they can be approached. And so here we can see that these are also a and type of situation that can build on one another. But similar to beaches, these are looking at things that are happening within the marsh system, diagnosing them there and then treating them there. But then there are lots of problems that we're seeing in the marshes that can be treated outside of the marshes. So we're going to talk about one of those today, and we're going to talk about secondary transportation infrastructure. So not our main highways, but our different scale roads. So the challenge that we're facing here is looking at road runoff and habitat segmentation. So this is a photo of the causeway in the in the Gloucester's river marsh system. And we can see that it segments the two types, sections of the marsh. So they're not able to have water flow that goes between or species that are going between. And then also flooding. So whenever these roads flood, they're including rainwater runoff back into the marsh. So that's like the immediate problem. This result of that problem is the proliferation of invasive species, limited hydrology, which we talked about, and then also the danger as individual structures and homes are segmented during these flooding events. So this map looks at Cape Ann as a whole and all of the vulnerabilities of different roads going through it. And so a few of the major ones are Atlantic Street, which runs, and I think hopefully is on the map, but runs through that marsh system, and then also acknowledging that the Highway 128 is also within the flood zone and has a few issues. But beyond just the immediate roads that will flood, something that we were talking about earlier is the homes that will be cut off while that flooding occurs. So 10% of the structures on Cape Ann are cut off from access to both emergency services and evacuation potential when secondary roads flood. So that's all your back roads. When those flood, 10% of structures are cut off. When your primary roads flood, 73% of the structures on Cape Ann are cut off from access to emergency services. So that's something that is happening at a larger scale, but we can kind of look at in pieces. So when we're talking about them specifically within the West Annisquam, we can talk about scenario 0. So scenario 0 is that roads continue to prevent this ecological migration, causing the loss of high marsh habitat, and then flooding will prevent evacuation and access to emergency services, as we were discussing. Scenario 1 is to inform residents of the risk, like let everybody know that the flooding will occur, how long we anticipate being cut off from access so that individuals can prepare for that. And then also doing a bit of repair. So culverts are repaired or installed to improve that hydrological exchange. So those are two things that are a little bit reactive to the current problem. And also thinking about the maintenance plan. So if some of these roads are being washed out and they have lots of potholes, if they're being replaced, we can replace them in the kind of standard way, or they can be part of the maintenance plan that talks about new ways they can be replaced to address the flooding or to absorb more rainwater. So scenario 2 looks at a bit more collaboration. So this is about mitigation. So it's identifying where on these roads they can be divided, elevated, or fortified to restrict floodwaters. But it's really about using the existing road system and just augmenting it to operate a little bit better. And then scenario 3 looks at the potential to relocate some of these roads. So one example of that is on your sheets on the table is the relocation of Causeway Street, which is where the lobster land is and the car dealerships, and then redirecting that traffic through the existing streets. And then the other version of that is Atlantic Street. An alternative route can be provided, and then the access to all those developments can be reoriented so that way in the meantime you have 2 points of access, but then if Atlantic Street floods there is an alternative. And so this map kind of represents that. And there's actually an existing right-of-way between the private properties that would allow the development of that road to be possible, which is interesting. So Here we can kind of see that, again, we only talked about like 2 of the infrastructures that are represented on your sheet, but it kind of gave us a taste for some of the challenges and then the interventions that can address those challenges. So in a similar way, we kind of selected a couple of the scenarios to pair together and then envisioned what that would look like. So on your maps of the marsh that you have on your table, the bottom road is the main Yankee Division Highway, and then the marsh system that's directly north of that highway. And then we envisioned what some of these implementations means, both like when they're being done, and then what they mean at scale. So thinking about doing some marsh ditch restoration versus adding some oyster reefs throughout the marsh. So that was the kind of quick overview of the beach and marsh landscapes, which is also paired within the forest and downtown landscapes. So I'm going to invite Charles to come up and talk a little bit about that and then provide some concluding context.
Thanks, Sarah. I think the thing I wanted to mention here is, for the people that work in the climate space and the people that we collaborate with and learn from and people that we respect, overwhelmingly, are thinking about climate adaptation from the point of view of how natural systems relate to our built infrastructures. And one thing that we can say, this is not new, but it seems clear that most of those people are advocating for a combination of both gray and green solutions. So old, 19th, 20th century hard infrastructures. We can't do this with just nature-based solutions alone. At the same moment, it seems very short-sighted from our point of view to not think about nature-based solutions and the ecosystems into which these interventions of heavy infrastructure land. And so what we can say is that our systems of procurement and governance and funding and the disciplinary and professional responses, the consulting firms and engineers available to respond to those procurement requirements, et cetera, are sort of misaligned often to the kinds of challenges that we face. They're often built to, fight the previous war, to use that metaphor. And we've gotten quite good, frankly, at building pipes and roads and bridges and a range of other things that need to be maintained. Having said that, the most interesting thinking in our world is really about the intersection between these living systems and those infrastructures, right? That relationship. And in that regard, Cape Ann is really beautifully positioned to help us think about that, right? Because you have so many great examples of these places. A second thing that I want to mention here is that, and you've already heard it in my remarks and in Sarah's remarks, is that the way that we think about climate is really as a kind of accelerant to previously existing conditions. So it's not as though we're going to go from today to some apocalyptic or cataclysmic future, but as we look at 2030, 2050, 2070, we begin by identifying the things that we're already doing, right? Building grocery stores in the marsh, or not allowing the beach to migrate naturally because of property and road alignments and all the other, the vulnerability of populations on this side of the bridge in the context of a storm event, et cetera. And those are things that exist a priori well before climate change. Right? They're not about climate change per se. They're simply things we could be doing a better job of. And what I want to share with you here is that Cape Ann is well serviced by really fantastically well-informed, literate, committed folks like yourselves. Great literature. I find no lack of scientific or technical knowledge here. Ultimately, that's heartening for us because we do work in a lot of places where that's not the case. I'm quite optimistic about the future of Cape Ann, given what I've said about the quality of thought about the place and then a deep commitment that people have, the attachment to the place. But it's not just a kind of emotional attachment or years spent. It's a kind of literate, kind of self-aware, well-informed kind of understanding of the place. So in that context, our observation is that there's great opportunity here also. You have great ecosystems to build upon and work from. And at the same moment, we know that this will, with the context of a changing climate, increasingly put pressure on things that are already challenging, right? So in that context, I would invite you to think with us about climate change as something which is already started. Individuals and institutions are already responding to it, so there's no singular project and there's no start date. It's already happening. And in that context, looking at you, Greg, we can't expect government to do everything, right? In the context of civil society, institutions, individual landowners, the business sector, the civic society, a range of other actors are also going to play a part. They already are. And so in that range, what you're sensing already is an incredible level of complexity, right? You can see in the diagram, maybe you can't see in the diagram behind me, between the impact of human activity in natural ecosystems is already something that we're dealing with. We're already dealing with pesticides and fertilizers in runoff in the ecosystem. That's because of the culture of desirability of lawns, that's already a challenge, right? The fact that we've built so many roads and impervious surfaces drains quite a lot of toxic material. The fact that many of us have septic systems which are on individual land and at various levels of maintenance, all of those things contribute to pressures on these ecosystems, especially the marsh landscapes and the beach landscapes. That, combined with our culture of property rights and the inability to move things, means natural systems that would be more resilient without those limitations come up against barriers, right? Another challenge that Sarah mentioned that I want to reinforce is Cape Ann is home to 54, is that the number? 47? Some number of dozens of beaches that are each extraordinary, and each of you have your favorites. And in that regard, it's a fiction for us to pick one to study in greater detail. Having said that, to help facilitate a thinking about Cape Ann's beaches in which they're all connected, and that we could benefit from understanding a little bit more about all of them, because about half of them will structurally be really impeded by raising sea levels and the kind of the granite geology. That's going to be quite tough. In other places, there is space to migrate. That's going to put pressure on our social and political and economic responses. In that context, the challenges that we face in this work, and again, thank you for all of your support and your help with this, is really embodied in our collaboration with the steering committee, which is, on the one hand, we feel a great need to reach out and talk to folks about their lived experience, their values, their desires, well before we do any research at all. On the other hand, this kind of work really benefits from seeing, well, what are the studies that have already been done? Because people have been studying this place for a very long time. And that produces a kind of dialectic. And then that comes into conversation with, well, then what are we supposed to do? We need to have actionable projects, pilot projects we could actually look at and study with greater feasibility. So in that context, there's a kind of trialectic between talking to folks about the future of Cape Ann that they find desirable and want to advocate for, versus studying it from a scientific or technical point of view to say, well, here are your options, or here's a ways of thinking about the place. And that in relationship to, well, is there a project here that has traction, right? So what we're doing in our 800 pages is all of those things, yes to all, basically. And you can enter it in any of those points. My friend Valerie will say that we're going to pretend for this evening as if the report doesn't exist. And we're going to talk to folks and see what they're interested in. But what I want to say is that the report will be made available in two forms. So first of all, many of you already have received a digital copy. Please reach out to us if you want one, a PDF. It'll also be made available at the end of this month on or about June 30th in a public-facing website. It's capeann.officeforurbanization.org. All the previous work from previous years since 2020 is already housed there, and the 2023 work of landscapes of regeneration is going to be housed there by the end of this month. So again, thanks for coming out to join us. We are beginning just now a piece of work over the next 2 years, 2024-25, that will look at disciplinary and professional expertise around the built environment that deal with, on the one hand, questions of finance and risk, questions of governance and policy, and questions of engagement and communication. And in those lanes, in those areas of expertise, we've impaneled a really august group of academic advisors to help us think through those questions in the context of Cape Ann over the next year and a half, to try to bring the best available wisdom to bear on these questions from those particular points of view. Dick, I want to hand it over back to you and look forward to chatting with you.